O beautiful for spacious skies. Harold had been happy with his farm. He grew his own vegetables and his own marijuana. In the evenings he was happy to sit in his rocking chair and roll a joint, sit back and watch the sun take a last sip of the old school boss. The land had meant everything to him and Diane. It had been a commune of 17 people who had left Berkeley in the mid-70s when Harold was 35. It had continued that way for almost 15 years, buying and selling shares of the land as people came and went. Yesterday, however, at 11 o'clock in the morning, Harold mailed $3,000 to Claudia, who had lived in Ontario for the last 2 years and had finally married a Canadian. Yesterday he bought the last of it. All of them were gone. He leaned back and propped his feet up on the railing, staring out at the windmill. He hadn't even really liked Claudia. She never understood what had gone into making everything from scratch. She had come to the commune late and stayed long enough to have a baby because he supposed she wanted to say it was from a commune. She bought a share of it, stayed a while, and then left. She was the last of them. Harold and Diane were alone. He finished his joint, stood up from his chair, and said into the kitchen that he was going for a little walk. At the bottom of the stairs he stared for a while at the road. He didn't want to go for a long walk. Instead he turned and went around the house and across the field to the barn. Hidden beside the door hung a key which he used to open the padlock. He put the key back and opened the door against the tall grass. Inside he squinted upward in the darkness. Like a recurring dream, the old hang glider reappeared. It had hung there perhaps 7 years. He couldn't remember. A rope hung from its harness, and he reached up and tugged at it gently, watching the cloth dip and bob. He had meant to use it soon after the last time. In his mind he could feel the harness around him and remember the feeling, remember the tiny people on the beach below, remember the sound of the wind against his ears. He tugged at the rope again and watched it bob. Dust lifted from the fabric and sparkled like glass in the air. He went to the door and switched on the lights. Only one of them worked. It gave a dim and local light. He had never noticed the wooden wall before. It had turned into a museum, a three-dimensional scrapbook that was difficult for him to look at. He found a crate and set it on its end, and there he sat down, trying not to look at the wall. But there it was. It didn't matter whether he wanted to see it or not. He had already seen it. A pile of frisbees lay scattered across the bench. Every color belonged to a different person. Why hadn't he thrown them all away? Why had he kept them there? A blue jogging outfit hung from a nail. Below it, 3 pairs of running shoes. It wasn't so much that he missed any of them. It had been years since they had disappeared one by one. But the officiality of yesterday, sending the money off and leaving his name last on the list. How could a man resent ending up with 100 acres of good land and equipment? But he did. With his fingers he stroked his beard, like a cat that licks its fur after an insult. He calmed himself, told himself that he was all right. But deeper inside of him than his surface soothing could reach, he resented them all for leaving and for taking with them the only memories of his youth. He stood and walked over to the wall. Leaning close, he blew dust from a photograph of himself and Sarah and Tom Frankel and the woman Tom was with at the time, whose name Harold had forgotten. They stood not far from the land, on the beach in bathing suits. His hang glider strained behind him, impetuous to fly again, like a child. With a stroke he removed the frisbees from the bench and sat down. They were supposed to have stayed, he thought. They were supposed to have remembered. Then he remembered that lunch would be waiting for him. He wasn't hungry, but Diane was waiting. He sat there for a moment, unable to move, and then slowly he stood and went across the barn, touched the rope from the glider once more, and went out into the harsh sunlight. Diane had set the picnic table with lunch. On occasion they still ate outside. It was always dark inside the house. When she didn't mind bringing it out, it was more pleasant to eat on the picnic table under the redwood tree. There were egg salad sandwiches and garbanzo beans and a large salad and tea. All of it came from the land. They still kept 4 chickens for eggs. 4 was enough for the 2 of them. "Here you are," Diane said. She wore her gray hair in a bun, and her brown skirt trailed the dusty ground, and a white sweatshirt covered the rest of her body like so much deleted material. He sat down on the bench across from her, and without speaking, he began to eat. She felt his mood and began eating also, quietly, conserving herself. After his meal, he sipped his tea. When a peculiar feeling heated his stomach, a feeling like anger, his mouth opened, and he said, "Nice day for hang gliding." He said that, and then returned to his tea, as if the idea had appeared of its own accord, a bird landing for a moment and then flying away. She looked at him, and when she saw that he was not going to look up at her, she drank some tea herself, and the gentleness of her face tightened slightly. "Harold," she said. He didn't answer for an almost rude length of time. Then he looked up at her and nodded his head. "I was thinking that maybe we should sell the land," she said. He went back to his tea. "Why should we do that?" he asked. "We don't have to talk about why. Neither of us wanted to be here like this." A squirrel came down the trunk of the redwood and stopped near them, looking. Diane looked up at it. "He wants the garbanzo beans," she said. Harold, without looking at the squirrel, slid his plate to the end of the table and went back to his tea. "If Nicholas hadn't fed him, they wouldn't do that," Harold said. He wasn't amused. He was tired of hungry squirrels. He was tired of stopping chickens from trying to kill each other. He was tired of the picnic. "Where would we go? Back to Berkeley?" he said. "No, not to Berkeley. We could go anywhere. If we sold the place, we could go anywhere," she said. He turned from the table, looked at infinity, and saw the old school bus again. "I'd have to think about it," he said. In a while she put the dishes on top of each other and stood with them. "I was going into town. Did you want me to get you anything?" she asked. He shook his head, and she carried the dishes back into the house. He was still sitting at the picnic table when Diane came from the house, told him she'd be back in a few hours, and left in the car for town. He watched her drive away. A soft wind stirred the windmill, whining as it pumped a few more electrons into the batteries. His eyes lifted to watch it. The wind pressed invisibly against the blades. It had rotated during the day, and now the wind blew from the west. It had become a gentle, steady wind. It came from the ocean, west. Harold sniffed the air like a hunting dog. He listened to the wind, saw it with a sense that had no name. He focused on the question, how long would it last? It answered with a pressing conviction. It would last. On the palms of his hand, sweat began to form, and with it a memory of pulling from his back, a giant hand, lifting him upward. Out over the cliff, out over the ocean, a strong hand. In a moment he stood from the picnic table, and wiping his palms on his pants, he began to walk. He didn't move directly to the barn. He simply needed to move. The feeling was intolerant of sitting. As he moved in an arc around the house, a kind of spiral curve, he struck a trajectory which aimed him toward the barn. He knew where it was leading him, but he hadn't wanted to know. He hadn't wanted to override it with intelligence. He was sick of intelligence. He wanted to fly. In the barn he yanked the rope, tripped the lock above, and then slowly pulled it down to the ground. The wings unclamped and folded to the side. They had designed it, and it had won people over to their design. Dust billowed into the air, barn dust, thick and difficult to breathe. It rolled into a tight set of poles, and he lashed it once with a nylon belt. He lifted it to his shoulder and carried the old hang glider out the door. He walked in the direction of the old school bus. Once he had fixed his course by it, his mind was freed and flew ahead to the cliff. In his mind he saw everything again, even to the tiny people on the beach below. They were still there in his vision, grinning upward, cupping their hands and shouting, waving him on. He walked past the school bus and found the overgrown path. Tall grass snapped and hissed under his feet. His ankle twisted and he stopped dead where he stood to be sure it was not sprained. Then he looked up to stride again, more rhythmically, more smoothly, concentrating on movement itself. 20 feet before the cliff dropped off, he stopped, let the glider roll to the ground, and lowered himself to his knees, catching his breath. Then he sat on his heels and looked out over the ocean, feeling the wind against his face. 2 steel rods had been mounted like a low gate at the edge. They were used to steady oneself before the leap. They were still there, rusty, one bent more than the other. They were still trustworthy. He reached over to the glider and untied the nylon belt. He wished the wind would ease a moment, long enough to set the wings and brace himself, but it was steady. With a nylon cord, he tied the glider to the steel pole, and then he opened first one side of the wing and held it down with a round stone. Quickly he moved to the other side and pulled the cloth out, set the fiberglass tension rod, and twisted its column to tighten the fabric. It was a good design. On the ground, in tension, its back arched to the wind. It lifted evenly, perfectly, still wanting to fly. Twisting quickly, he was beneath it, and automatically his hands went about harnessing himself in. Pressing his fingers to the ground, he lifted himself to a crouch and tried to steady himself against the upward lift of the wings. His back lowered and swayed like an old tree. With one foot stepping carefully before the other, muscles in his legs straining to keep their contact with the ground, he moved toward the steel rods. Once the pull increased and he began walking backward by 2 steps before he pulled himself back by the cord. His arms extended toward the rods, hanging there without being able to move the next inch and grab them. Again he lost ground and pulled himself with the cord. With a last strain of his legs, he grabbed the rods and pulled himself between them, and quickly his one hand untied the cord from the glider and snapped back to steady himself with an anchoring grip. Now he inched himself to lean forward over the edge to see the bench some 800 feet below. Waves flattened, became 2-dimensional undulations, something that could have been any size or any distance from his reach. A child might have tried to reach out and touch the waves. He looked down to the empty beach, his head pulled upward to divert his eyes from below. "Look out, not down," his mind shouted. "Look out!" His neck strained to pull his view away from the vertical drop, but his eyes were locked beneath him. His teeth clenched, and since his strength was not great enough to oppose his compulsion to look down, he shut his eyes tightly and kicked his feet out behind him, letting go of his grip on the poles. His eyes opened, and the wind put its fist around his back and lifted him outward over the sea. It curved below him, rotating slowly, then snaked back again to twist in the other way. His ears pounded like steel drums, and between clenched teeth he sucked his lost breath back into his lungs. He went out, over the ocean, out beyond the sand and the waves, turning a full circle. The horizon raced by, blurry, at an obscure angle. It slid upward and spun around again. He looked for the sand. It was behind him, beyond his sight. He shifted his weight and arched his back. The sandy beach curved back before his eyes, distant, A thin slot of tan, too high in the sky, he thought, and strained to will himself forward more rapidly. The wind blew from the west, and he lifted his legs to catch it, to surf it back to the sand. Had the wind died? He listened. His ears pounded less. His fists clenched more tightly around the bar, trying to push the glider with his hands. The sand moved higher in the sky. The waves stretched out more quickly, and the ricocheted sunlight seared his eyes. But only his mind feared the water, while his body flew. Even the seagulls stopped crying, and watched this strange bird, a predator, hunting for its past.